I should just comment, in fairness to James Madison, that these remarks are not quite correct. The reason was that Madison was pre-capitalist. He's like just about everybody, Adam Smith, all the great figures from the Enlightenment. They're mostly pre-capitalist and very anti-capitalist in conception. You can't say they're anti-capitalist because there was no modern industrial capitalism around for them to have an opinion about. And this is a matter of interpretation. It's a matter of how you read texts, so you can read them a lot of different ways. But the way I read them, they were very anti-capitalist. That includes Adam Smith. And I think you can demonstrate that. But certainly Madison was. He believed that when he put power in the hands of the wealthy class of men, the more capable set of men, the wealthy of the country, that they were going to be, as he put it, enlightened statesmen and benevolent philosophers who would devote themselves to the welfare of all. Okay, that's a very pre-capitalist conception, that once you give power to the hands of the rich, they're just going to be benevolent philosophers and they're going to devote themselves, every minute of their day to the welfare of everyone else. I mean, it's like what corporate executives tell you now. They're sort of understand you have to say that, but by now, nobody believes it except the people who read these, watch these movies, which show you how it works. In those days, Madison really believed it, and he very quickly discovered that it wasn't true. Within a few years, by I think 1792, he was already very upset about the fate of this democratic experiment, which he thought was failing. He condemned what he called the daring depravity of the times, as the business leaders who have now been given power use that power, he said, to become the tools and tyrants of government. They overwhelm government with their powers and combinations, and they're bribed by its largesses. And they're just serving self-interest, not the interest of the general public, and he thought that was deplorable and so on, but that's because he perceived the way the system that he had designed was actually functioning. That description, rhetoric is kind of nice. Some people don't use fancy rhetoric like that today, but it's a perfect description of today. What's called the industrial capitalist system today is in fact one in which private power is the tool and tyrant of government, overwhelms it by its combinations, it's bribed by its largesses. That's a pretty good description of 1997. With all the changes that have taken place since 1792, there's a good deal of stability to all this, including the commitment to the principle that the primary goal of government is to protect the minority, the opulent, from the majority. You read yesterday's budget proposal carefully and you'll get a good example of how that commitment plays itself out. And the increasingly significant idea, overwhelmingly significant idea, particularly among liberals, like, say, Bernays, that it is necessary to control people's minds because they're too much of a danger. We, as one of the leading, take a look at, say, the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, big encyclopedia in 1933, so this is still pre-Second World War. There actually is an entry on propaganda. Remember, propaganda was a usable term then. And the entry on propaganda is written by a very distinguished political scientist, liberal political scientist, Harold Lasswell, one of the founders of modern political science, in fact, of communications and so on. And it's worth reading. It's a page or two, Xerox it out and read it. He says, these are paraphrases, but they're pretty close to quotes. He says that we must not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about people being the best judges of their own interests. They are not. We're the best judges of their interests, we smart guys. And we must therefore ensure that those idiots out there don't get into trouble, by actually using their theoretical right to vote to interfere where they don't belong, like in the public arena. So we got to keep them out of the public arena somehow and make sure that it's just us smart guys who are in there. And it's for their good, of course. It's kind of like you don't let, your 3-year-old, in my case, grandchild, run across the street, because she may want to run across the street, but it's be improper to let her have that choice. And the same is true about the masses. They have to be controlled. They have to be controlled at the workplace. They have to be kept out of the political arena. They're not going to understand the need to protect the minority, the opulent against the majority. They're going to have all these strange leveling impulses, and they're going to do all kinds of things which will, mess the world up in all sorts of horrible ways. So for their benefit, we have to regiment their minds the way an army regiments their bodies, ensure that they're under control, make it very clear that they don't participate in workplace management, and certainly not in the political arena. They're to be outside somewhere. And the dedication with which this task has been pursued is pretty awesome. Just to take right after the fall of the House of Labor in the 1920s, when American labor really was smashed, and people were privatized and tried to accommodate individually to a most undemocratic America, as Montgomery and others have pointed out. That was a time when there was great awe about the end of history and the utopia of the masters, and it's all over, us good guys have won, everybody else is at our feet, kind of like some of the stuff you read today. And it sort of looked like that. It's pretty much looked that way. Well, a few years later, as you know, the whole thing collapsed, and there was militant working class struggle and all sorts of other popular activism, and there had to be an accommodation. There had to be some kind of accommodation to these unwashed masses who were getting out of line, sit-down strikes and all sorts of things. And there was, indeed. There was this fragile social compact that Doug Fraser referred to was indeed established. It wasn't any gift. It was won by struggle. Meaning the labor laws and the limited social system. In fact, American workers back in the 1930s began to get the rights that had been standard long before, even in much more brutal societies. You read the right-wing British press over the, say, early part of this century. They can't believe how bad American workers are treated. The same was true of visitors from Australia and so on. By the 1930s, the U.S. was sort of brought into the more or less the mainstream of industrial society on these matters, to a limited extent, in fact, but to some extent. That caused hysteria among the masters. You read the business press by 1936 or 37. Again, these are things which in a really free society everybody would study in elementary school, because they're really important. These give the real framework of the society, in my view. They were talking about the hazard facing industrialists and the rising political power of the masses, and how we must do something to save ourselves or our way of life will be gone and we don't have a lot of time to do it. They started right away. By the late 30s, there was a big anti-labor campaign that had built up. With new techniques. There was still use of force, but it was understood that that's not going to work the way it did. So there was a shift to more propaganda, community the main idea was called the Mohawk Valley formula, I guess. Is that what it was called? Something like that. Yeah, Mohawk Valley formula was designed by a lot of public relations hotshots around 36, 37, at the time of some of the steel strikes, to have a new, what they called scientific methods of strike breaking. We don't just come in, with clubs and shoot people and smash their heads and that sort of thing. We do it the scientific way, because the old way doesn't work anymore. And the scientific methods of strike breaking were, in fact, drawn from the public relations ideas of the kind that I talked about. The main idea was to mobilize the community against the strikers and the union activists, to present a picture which is by now so standard that you can hardly turn on the tube without seeing it, because it's just poured out in, like streams ever since then. The basic idea is to present a picture of the world that looks kind of like this. There's us, kind of like a big happy family in the community. The honest workman going off every morning with his lunchbox, his loyal wife who's making the meals and taking care of the kids, the hard-working executive who's toiling day and night in the interests of his workers and the community, the friendly banker who's running around looking for people to lend money to, and so on and so forth. That's us, and we're all in harmony. Harmony was a big word. We're in harmony, we're all together. It's Americanism. You might take a look at that word Americanism. It's an unusual term. It's the kind of term that you only find in totalitarian societies, as far as I know. So like in the Soviet Union, anti-Sovietism was considered the gravest of all crimes, and the Brazilian generals had some concept like that, anti-Brazilian. But try, say, publishing a book on anti-Italianism and see what happens in the streets of Rome or Milan. I mean, people won't even bother laughing. It's a ludicrous idea. The idea of Italianism or Norwayism or something like that, these would just be objects of ridicule in societies that have some kind of residue of a democratic culture inside people's heads. I don't mean in the formal systems. But in totalitarian societies it is used, and as far as I know, the United States is the only free society that has such a concept. Maybe there's another one. You might try it in places, But anyhow, Americanism is an anti-Americanism and un-Americanism and so on. These are concepts which go along with harmony and getting rid of those outsiders and all that kind of stuff. Another part is simply to induce hatred and fear among people. So it's a diverse society. You go to Europe, most places are pretty uniform. This is a very diverse society. So it's easy. For propagandists, it's pretty easy to get people to hate the guy next door because it looks a little different or one thing or another. And huge campaigns go on to instigate divisions among people. I don't have to tell you about this. It's all so familiar. You go on. But these are very natural techniques of social control. If you can't control people by force, you have to control their minds, you have to control their attitudes, you have to, exactly like they say. Well, going back to the Mohawk Valley formula, the idea was to move into a community, flood it with, where there's a strike going on, flood it with propaganda, take over the media, the churches, the schools, everywhere else, pour in this propaganda about harmony and so on, the way I described it. And then there's those bad guys out there who are trying to disrupt our harmonious lives, like that union organizer is probably a communist or an anarchist anyway, and probably un-American, and he's trying to, destroy all these wonderful things we have, and we got to band together and kick him out. We have to defend our way of life against this. A lot of religion gets thrown in. Remember that the United States is an extremely fundamentalist country. I mean, you look comparative statistics. Usually religious fundamentalism declines as industrialization goes up. It's pretty close correlation. The United States is off the chart. It ranks with devastated peasant societies, probably more fundamentalist than Iran. There's all, why this is so is, I don't know. But, in fact, it's a complicated question. But one factor is that it was certainly consciously fomented by business leaders. That goes way back to the 19th century, when they were supporting their favorite, John D. Rockefeller's favorite evangelist was, who he poured a lot of money into, was some guy who said that people ought to have more enlightened ideas than labor agitation. That was one of his famous phrases. And the more enlightened ideas are, go to church and listen to orders and, do what they tell you and shut up. That's the more enlightened idea. And it's a really interesting case because the Mohawk Valley was the model that was later used for strike breaking and destruction of the labor movement in the post-war period. So it's quite interesting to see what happened right there. Incidentally, I don't know any literature on this. Do you? Yeah, so these are untouchable topics, And you can almost say that anything that's important, it's going to matter for people's lives, it's got to be sort of off the agenda. And it sort of makes sense. You don't want people to know about it. Like, you don't want people to know the wrong kind of thing. After all, that makes sense. It's like it's not a conspiracy or anything. It's just common sense if you have a certain degree of power and authority and privilege. You just don't want people to know things that might be harmful to them because they're really like children, remember. And we're the ones who have to make the decisions for them.